A visitor to the Normandy coast of France today would find it much as it has been for the last 1,000 years. It's a quiet and peaceful place where seagulls loop and swoop over sandy beaches, and the winds carry the sounds of crashing waves and rustling grasses on sandy dunes. It's difficult to imagine that it was once the place of a ferocious and terrible battle, tolling thousands of lives. Yet in the midst of fear, anger, and death were acts of courage, humanity, and life that stand out. One such story happened in the small hamlet of Angoville-au-Plain, 6 miles inland from Utah Beach, where 2 American medics rendered aid to friend and foe alike. Thousands of feet above the English Channel, 20-year-old paratrooper and medic Kenneth looked down from aboard a C-47 transport aircraft and saw the vast seaborne armada sailing toward the Norman coastline. The sight of so many men and equipment gave Moore some comfort as he flew into an unknown and dangerous future. Approaching their drop zones, the Allied aircraft reduced altitude and began to encounter German anti-aircraft fire. Moore and the rest of the paratroopers in his plane anxiously awaited the green light that would send them leaping into the night. After what seemed like ages, the green light finally flashed, and Moore jumped at an altitude of only about 300 feet, giving his parachute just enough time to open before he splashed into a flooded field. At about the same time, 19-year-old Robert Wright, another medic, crashed into the ground near Angoville. From his landing site, he could see the church tower of a small village, and he carefully made his way toward it. Once at the church, Wright hung a Red Cross flag above the doors, setting it apart as a safe space from the battle that raged around him. The church was small as churches go, and was little more than a stone hall capped with a small tower. Ken Moore arrived shortly after Wright, and with him were paratroopers who had been injured as a result of jumping from too low an altitude. Soon, however, battle wounded began to appear for help at the little stone church. After stabilizing the wounded, Wright and Moore left them in the care of the saints, who looked silently down from the small church altar, while they themselves went out in search for more wounded. It didn't matter to Wright or Moore what uniform a wounded man wore. They were there to help the Americans and Germans alike, and both armies tended to respect the medics who worked the fields. In one instance, Wright and Moore arrived at the edge of a field where Germans and Americans were fighting. Both sides held their fire as the 2 medics crossed the field and began again after they were clear. Aware of the dangers that came with placing wounded enemies together in the church, Wright and Moore established a strict no-weapons policy for anyone who sought treatment inside. Weapons were to be left at the door. During the course of the night and the next day, the church at Angoville changed hands a few times. Regardless of who controlled the village, Wright and Moore carried on caring for those in the church. Once, when the Germans held the village, a German soldier armed with a machine gun burst inside, but upon seeing that his wounded countrymen were among those receiving care, he made the sign of the cross and left. In another incident, a retreating German officer arrived at the church seeking treatment. At first, he refused to relinquish his weapons, but eventually relented. Once inside, he refused to be treated by anyone but a German, and because there were no German medics inside, he decided to wait until the Germans retook the village before receiving care. As time wore on, however, his wounds overcame his pride, and he allowed the Americans to care for his wounds. In one event, the sanctuary of the church was threatened, and Moore was wounded when a mortar attack struck the building. One shell crashed through the church ceiling and smashed into one of the old stone tiles. Luckily for everyone inside, the shell was a dud, and Wright carefully picked it up and carried it out into a field. Moore was wounded when ceiling plaster, cracked and loosened by the battle, fell and struck him in the head. Dazed and bleeding, Moore shook it off and carried on with his duties. As the Allies advanced inland, things began to calm down around the church. To their surprise, 2 young German soldiers appeared out of the small church tower and surrendered after having been there the entire time. In total, Robert Wright and Kenneth Moore spent 2 days caring for the wounded. Shortly before leaving on June 8th, they treated a young French boy for shrapnel wounds. The boy was the last surviving member of his family, all of whom had died during the course of the battle. Both Robert Wright and Kenneth Moore carried on fighting and both survived the war and returned to civilian life in the United States. Robert Wright died in December 2013. Kenneth Moore died a year later in December 2014. The church at Angoville-au-Plain, where Wright and Moore performed such remarkable service, still bears many of the signs of battle. Many of the pews where they lay the wounded are still stained with blood. The stone tile where the mortar landed is still indented and cracked. The windows have been replaced with beautiful stained glass that depicts American symbols of freedom, the 101st logo, and paratroopers. The church still serves the little community and has hosted a number of small ceremonies to honor the humanity of Robert Wright and Kenneth Moore. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, share, and consider subscribing.